So good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to see such a good group. I'm Carolyn Eswine. I'm here at UW-Milwaukee in the Department of Urban Planning, and we are really excited to have Angela Brooks with us, joining us today. I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We always encourage you to use the map, be interactive, find out who was on your land before you are there presently, and how you can incorporate that into some of your planning efforts. Welcome to the UWM's Innovative Cities Lecture Series. We are a virtual series about every 3 weeks. You can gain CM credit if you're AICP certified. We have a link for that as well, or you can search for this session. We are really excited to have Angela Brooks here. As many of you know, she is the president of APA, but she's also the director of the Corporation of Supportive Housing in Illinois. So she is bringing her two different perspectives, wearing a couple of different hats today. We know that there is a challenge right now. There's a study out about underproduction of housing. There's a challenge of how do you manage supportive, affordable, and market rate housing for many of the planners that are joining us today. So she's going to share a variety of strategies and examples. I encourage you, if you have questions or comments, to type it in the chat. And if it is really relevant at that moment, I will interject and she'll address your question at that point. Otherwise, we will have a series of questions and answers after she's finished presenting. We also have a survey at the end for you, and we have an upcoming, our next one is equitable zoning. We're going to have a panel on November 15th, including Susan Henderson. She is working right now with the city of Milwaukee. She's with Placemakers. Sam Leichling from the city of Milwaukee, and Tammy Susie from Wauwatosa, which is a local community that has a report that has already addressed some of the changes. So that's our upcoming. And then for those of you who are local, we will have an in-person event on November 30th. We have 2 Brookings fellows talking to us about the success for downtowns is shared prosperity. So that'll be November 30th at 4 p.m. here at UWM. So at this point, I'm going to transfer it over to Angela. Excited to have you with us today and look forward to hearing your comments.
Well, thank you. And I am super excited to be here, albeit virtually. I wanted to be with the Wisconsin chapter for the state chapter conference, but it was a conflict with, I don't know, some other APA channel travel. So I'm glad to be here. I do want to acknowledge, for those of you, I'm originally from Seattle, so my father never gets to hear me speak. So he joined us today. So I'm just saying hello to my father, because that's not very often, and also to Josh, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last few years as he served as the liaison to the AICP Commission. So I've heard a lot about the work that he's doing in Wisconsin. So thank you for inviting me to participate, especially to talk about a topic that's super close to my heart, which is housing. I have literally spent my whole career dedicated to providing housing for individuals who are underhoused or unhoused. My core belief is very simple. I believe that every human being deserves a safe, clean, affordable place, not only to live, but also to thrive. And, you know, a little bit more background on me that kind of helps how I took kind of a career pivot. I think when I was a student, I was like, I'm going to be a planning director by the time I'm 35. And then I was in graduate school and I worked as a parole officer, super random. But I realized at that point that no one should worry about housing conditions. A client of mine had come in for an appointment and I was going to have to detain her, but she had her child with her. And my boss was like, you know, you can call Child Protective Services, or if someone's home, you could take her home. And so I opted to take her home. And don't give me credit for being like all that compassionate. I really went to take her home because it was almost 5 o'clock and that would have added on like 3 hours to my day. At any rate, I did take her home. And she lived in a public housing development next to the French Quarter until that moment I thought was vacant. And I just couldn't believe that publicly owned housing stock looked like that. And that's how my career took a pivot. And it was probably one of the greatest decisions of my life. So we talked a little bit earlier about where we're at. So being a houser, you can imagine the nation's housing crisis is extremely concerning to me. We are, in fact, in a housing crisis. And we all know as planners that we really lead the solutions and we're crucial. And we know that housing is in short supply. Earlier in this month, I was in DC for the release of the 2023 Housing Under Production Report from Up for Growth. APA continues to sponsor this report as we really need the data to illustrate the true magnitude of the housing crisis. The findings, unfortunately, weren't great news. This year's report found that housing underproduction is spreading geographically. Small towns and suburban communities are not exempt. And even more disappointing, nationally, underproduction increased nearly 3% since last year's report, 3.9 million missing homes. Back in 2012, that shortfall was just over 1.6 million units. This is not just a coastal problem. Housing underproduction increased by 4.5% in the suburbs. In small towns, due to the sudden and dramatic drop in unit delivery, housing underproduction increased by 47.8%. We need to continue to work with partners and work with each other to help identify planning-led solutions to this crisis. I know there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and I stress this as I speak across the country that we have to come up with solutions that work for communities individually. APA is working with the National League of Cities for the Housing Supply Accelerator. We are super excited about this because it brings all the players in the housing world, planners, local leaders, builders, financiers, policymakers, and our state and federal partners. The goal of this important initiative is really to identify solutions to improve local capacity, identify critical solutions, and speed up reforms. Solving this national crisis really is going to take everyone. I am honored to co-chair this with NLC President and Tacoma, Washington Mayor Victoria Woodards. Over the past year, we've convened with our steering committee of planners and local leaders to really dig into construction, housing finance, and land use reforms that really have become obstacles to increasing housing supply across the country. And because I'm wearing both hats, I want to talk a little bit about the job that actually pays me, because sometimes it's hard to remember the difference. The Corporation for Supportive Housing is a national nonprofit. We do anything around housing policy, particularly around increasing the capacity of permanent supportive housing. We're also a lender, so we do pre-development and acquisition loans. We feel like that's the space that in PSH is really often unmet. And as you can see on this slide, we've awarded more than $1.5 billion in loans and grants. We've done work that has helped to create over 385,000 new affordable and supportive housing units. And we do technical assistance that really provides quality homes and supports to people who live in supportive housing. And because not all planners are very aware of what we are talking about with supportive housing, I figured I would start by really defining what it is that I am referring to. Supportive housing is affordable housing where supportive service providers actively engage tenants in flexible, keyword voluntary, and comprehensive services, and work with property management to support tenant stability to ensure that the housing remains a positive community asset for the long term. Supportive housing is the scaffolding for delivery of more effective and responsive public services. And many people often ask me, how does a planner end up in supportive services? You know, there's an affordable housing crisis in this country, as well as just market rate and permanent supportive housing. And the affordable housing crisis is well documented by the slowdown of unit creation following the foreclosure crisis. And it's a process that was already not meeting the necessary demand. Increasing support for individuals eligible supportive housing also relies on increasing support of affordable housing. If a person is accessing benefits like rental assistance in supportive housing, that may not transfer to something like a guaranteed housing choice voucher, and the incentive to move on is low to non-existent. The lack of expanding comprehensive supports for low-income households is causing all funding support for housing to slow down and become more cumbersome. While affordable housing, supportive housing, and other housing support areas have their own unique funding mechanisms, which I'll get to a little later, all sources impact one another as there are not comprehensive and flexible supports that supplement one another. Some places have instituted systems like flexible housing pools that provide fluid bridge subsidies to allow for individual funding opportunities that do not fit into silos. Yet, even those systems run into long term funding concerns where individuals will have to move on from bridge subsidies into a space without supports. In general, places are not incentivized to provide this flexible support and have to creatively address the ongoing need for rental and service support through other means. So the goal for planners really is in expanding permanent supportive housing. That includes affirmatively furthering fair housing, tying social work, public health, and other public agencies together, pushing for more community accountability, and making budgeting and investments easier to talk about. Planners may not be directly involved in some of these specific actions, but we are responsible for being aware of the protection of and development of affordable housing in our communities. It's kind of six buckets we can focus on. Back in 2003, APA's last policy guide on homelessness. That's when APA identified a selection of focus areas for planners as well as policy positions. Only one major policy position on homelessness was included in the 2019 Housing Policy Guide, which I was honored to co-author, while the bulk of that document certainly focuses on making places more affordable in general. The APA suggestion include focusing on land use through comprehensive plan updates, collaboration with continuums of care, diligent use of public funding, and emphasis on furthering fair housing, and partnering with local service agencies. And the last thing was the establishment of a national housing trust fund. While barriers to housing expansion in this report reads eerily similar to some of the challenges facing local communities today, the last element of a national housing trust fund was established in 2008, and almost $700 million from it was made available to states in 2021. These policy statements underlined the need for cross-sector collaboration, a sphere where planners are uniquely positioned to affect change in their communities. Planners can and need to lead through partnerships and looking ahead with their communities to ensure housing first comes first. Land use planning and zoning are perhaps the most relevant topic of interest for planners to consider when reflecting on how a place can foster the development of supportive and affordable housing. Zoning law and practice is one of the most contentious and publicly debated topics in planning practices. I sit on the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals, and I have lots of thoughts on that. And I've had lots of stories that I might write a book about later about contentious public hearings. As planners, we do not solely dictate zoning changes or modifications. Local land use policy shifts must address a number of common challenges. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is a key restrictor. The process behind zoning changes, the time that land use policy needs to adequately bring about transformation, sentiments that protect against large-scale changes of any kind. Zoning reform continues to be one of APA's key policy priorities. We know solutions must be planning-led. We know solutions must be unique to each community, and we absolutely know solutions have to be equitable. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that historically the planning profession has used regulations like zoning to restrict access and opportunity of certain populations. As a profession, we have to acknowledge our past or we will not be able to move forward. One resource to help you is the Zoning and Equity Policy Guide. APA released this guide earlier this year, and it is different than any of the other policy guides I've ever seen. It was written with the goal of empowering the local and regional planner, but more importantly, to be readable for your citizens and your elected leaders. It provides practical and direct application to planning work. It prioritizes reversing and alleviating disproportionate impacts of zoning on historically disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. The guide also provides a list of 8 actions you might bring forth in your community. Zoning code realignment and community development are ongoing and reflective actions that can meaningfully contribute to expanding all housing options in your communities. It could be from increasing density, expanding by right multifamily zoned areas, creating transit-oriented development zones, ADUs, streamlining or shortening your permitting process for land uses that you think will really bring the kind of development you want, and so on and so forth. So while this type of recognition seeks to increase the number of places where supportive and affordable housing can be built, incorporating zoning changes into neighborhood plans is another mechanism increasing all options of expanding housing across the city. Local area plans have the opportunity to introduce more innovative and targeted solutions for communities that are interested in expanding supportive and or affordable housing across their jurisdiction, as well as to tie the housing development to other policy initiatives such as transportation, infrastructure, and social services. In Los Angeles, the city has formally recognized supportive housing as a unique housing topology across the downtown area. Important to underline is that the land use and zoning are long-term shifts that help move the needle gradually. They're just pieces of a larger puzzle that require additional funding, support, and local policy action. As land use becomes more financially competitive in redeveloped areas, planners will also have to identify legal protections for low-income households that might otherwise see themselves displaced from their homes following investments in the built environment. Santa Clara County has acknowledged that it is one of the largest unhoused populations in the country, and they've made steps toward communicating costs related to caring for unhoused individuals versus supportive housing. And I put that example on because it really shows you how we can really show the cost benefit analysis of providing units versus the cost of caring for unhoused individuals on the streets. I also included a link if any of you are interested in looking at racial equity index for your community. CSH has provided that, and so I'll make sure that link is available to you all as well. Next, I want to talk a little bit about things that I think are really important in the work that planners do. This image really illustrates a variety of missing middle housing options. We have to be creative in how we add to the housing supply. ADUs are another way we can expand housing options. Accessory dwelling units are a creative approach to adding more housing. APA has assembled policy guidance, models, statutes, and articles, basically any guidance or examples from other communities you might need on ADUs. With ADUs, we need to remove the regulatory and financial barriers. What does that mean? For my home state of Washington, the city of Walla Walla, which has the population of approximately 33,000 people, in 2018, Walla Walla officially approved zoning reform that streamlines accessory dwelling units. It promotes multifamily housing and effectively upzones the entire community. The maximum ADU size in Walla Walla is now 800 square feet, without limits relating to the principal dwelling unit. This was highlighted last summer in Planning Magazine. And you can see examples on the bottom of the slide reflecting the types of development that they receive. That really fits in with both it could fit in with urban, suburban, or rural type development.
Angela, I'm just going to jump in a second. We've done some research here in the Milwaukee area on ADUs, and although there's support for it and interest, there is always the cost issue that we're challenged. We don't have a strong enough market like Seattle or, San Francisco to support that. So we're looking at it more as, it could be, a place for my mother-in-law or a studio apartment. Do you have examples, or is the Walla one where it's a little bit more affordable and balancing that upfront cost with actually being affordable?
That's something that is something that is it is a hard thing to do. I mean, Walla Walla is certainly not a hot market by any stretch of the imagination, which is kind of why I pulled that one. But in terms of financing, I will definitely have to follow up with some examples. I can't think of any off of the top of my head. I know here in Chicago, we've made some city funds flexible for an ADU pilot project, but even then, it's somewhat of a luxury type thing that happens for people who are able to finance it on their own. But there are some flexible funds that the city's made available in those pilot areas.
That would be great. Anybody online, if you have examples, feel free to put it in the chat and we can share it as well. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Another thing I'll talk about is infill development. And this is an opportunity to expand housing options. I picked this one because I live by it, and it's in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood on the south side. We took a tour of it with the Housing Supply Accelerator. Um, the developer really does focus on infill development around transit. And so this particular TOD is the epicenter of every neighborhood, and they recognize that it's a way to really focus on underinvested neighborhoods like Bronzeville. This complex is 10 stories and 99 units, which doesn't seem relevant to a lot of folks possibly, but it's important to note that there's no other building this tall in this particular community, so it is first. So it's definitely one of the ones that we anticipated there would be some huge neighborhood resistance. It's designed really for the young professional. It includes a community room, a rooftop deck, a workout room, and a huge bike storage room. And it backs up to the green line, which you can see in the picture of the Chicago L. And the ground floor will have retail, including an independent coffee shop and a restaurant, also something that does not exist in this community. And you kind of wonder, as I alluded, we expected a little community resistance because of the scale of the building, but in fact, it got really kind of corny. And you'll see on the next slide, they started with the act of taking a selfie in front of the building as it was being constructed because people were really excited. The developer attributes really the excitement to satisfying unmet needs in the neighborhood and creating a community connection. There aren't a lot of places to sit down and eat. There's certainly not a lot of coffee shops. So just having another opportunity to create that space made this building a little bit more attractive to the community residents. Another opportunity for housing is through adaptive reuse, converting existing buildings that are no longer needed into housing for other uses. Converting underused buildings, such as I'm sure we're all experiencing vacant offices or even churches, which I'm starting to see more of, into housing. This approach really emphasizes preservation or rehabilitation of existing buildings. To utilize this approach, communities really have to look at their zoning and building regulations that can often be barriers to adaptive reuse. Not only do we need a diversity of housing, but we also need to think about the climate impacts with housing. In Western Colorado, Habitat for Humanity skipped natural gas and instead powered 100% of its 27-unit affordable housing development by solar panels. Not only is this meeting housing needs, but it is also considering environmental impacts. This example shows how we could be creative in thinking about what our housing looks like. The LEAP community in Boise, Idaho is using shipping containers converted into homes as a pilot. They include solar to help reduce the cost of ownership. Beyond adaptive reuse, we also know we need to consider how we're using land within our communities. Doug Shoup of UCLA, and you might have heard of his book or even read his book, The High Cost of Free Parking, estimates that the US has set aside 2 billion parking spaces for just around 250 million cars and light trucks. This results in far more land dedicated to cars than housing. And we certainly need to prioritize housing people over cars. Eliminating parking minimums is not just for large metro areas. Sandpoint, Idaho, with a population of about 8,700 people, has made significant strides in prioritizing housing people. The catalyst was the construction of a new bank in the historic downtown that would have required 200 new parking spots, despite being a block away from a municipal lot that was existing. This bank construction, along with the historic building interior remodel, was the catalyst to get the community talking about parking requirements. What were the results? Sandpoint eliminated parking minimums downtown in its entirety. Significantly reduced minimums for commercial and residential properties elsewhere in the city, and they instituted parking maximum. This type of zoning reform can help decrease high housing costs by promoting development, and other communities have used it as a powerful economic development tool. We also need to take a look at our building codes and bulk regulations such as minimum lot size, maximum height, and maximum floor area ratio as other impediments to expanding housing options and availability. Our language when discussing housing options is also very important. Nothing, and I'm sure all of us can relate to this, can turn a discussion sour faster than using a particular word like density. And anytime we talk about change in our community, people can get anxious and resistant. Planners have the unique opportunity of bringing compassion for both humans and the environment to shift land use conversations within our communities. We also have the responsibility of translating these acronyms and buzzwords into plain language for the communities that we work for. It's up to us to use to guide meaningful and productive conversations. These are a few tips that were shared in APA's Planning magazine. Jargon is a big issue as it can make someone feel excluded from the conversation. It can also incite fears due to the negative connotations associated with these words. We can also present zoning changes as an opportunity to offer new housing choices and options. We can focus on form and scale, not density metrics. We can share images, help the community see what missing middle could look like. And a lot of times it's not the image that they're picturing in their heads, so we have to show it to them. And above all, now is the time to take action. We need to start implementing solutions in our communities near and far to solve our housing crisis. I would be remiss if we didn't talk about zoning reform without talking about Minneapolis 2040 litigation. Certainly understand as we start talking about zoning reform, there are going to be some types of litigations, and Minneapolis would be the first. Minneapolis led a planning process that resulted in the nation's first major municipal led zoning overhaul to legalize missing middle housing in previously exclusionary single family zoning only zoning areas. The city did this in the context of updating its comprehensive plan and connected the reform with a variety of critical housing, infrastructure, and transportation policies. And it has already been a success. The city has increased housing production and supply faster than any city in the Midwest, and in doing so has tamed inflation. Just last month, Minneapolis became the first city in the country to see inflation dip below 2%. This is a direct result of controlling housing costs. And it all started with da, 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 a plan. Progress has been imperiled by NIMBY led litigation, but we're learning and getting a great plan approved and implemented may not be the end of the fight for housing supply and affordability. Despite the success of Minneapolis 2040, a group of NIMBY organizations masquerading as environmentalists sued the city under the state's environmental review law. The case is currently headed to the state Supreme Court and imperils progress in Minneapolis and threatens the planning across the state. For the record, APA is standing up for planning and reform in Minneapolis and across Minnesota. Planners are standing up in Minnesota. Our state chapter has filed an amicus brief on the case and has been outspoken in local media about both the progress of the plan and the misguided idea that increasing density and supporting housing opportunity is somehow anti environment. Quite the contrary, in fact. It is a remarkable abuse of the environmental review process. APA is also supporting efforts in the state legislature to exempt local comprehensive plans from these lawsuits and abuse of state environmental reviews. The effort nearly succeeded earlier this year and will be taken up again in 2024. Weaponization of legacy environmental laws is a new front in the battle for housing affordability and zoning reform. Unfortunately, regardless of the legal outcome in Minneapolis, this model is likely to be repeated in other states and cities pursuing zoning reform. We're seeing a similar lawsuit in Arlington, Virginia to try to stop their missing middle housing reform. And notoriously, there have been a number of anti housing, anti planning lawsuits in California. So much so that Governor Newsom just signed a new law curtailing the use of CEQA in certain housing contexts. As we push for reform, we can expect this tactic to be repeated. APA will be working in the courts and legislatures to fight for locally led plans and reforms like Minneapolis 2040. We will be examining this issue in more detail when APA convenes in the spring in Minneapolis for NPC 24. Now, onto something a little bit lighter. Now, unlike other times, there are more federal opportunities and funding opportunities to help create and introduce new housing. Pro Housing is a new federal competitive grant program totaling $85 million. APA has partnered with HUD and Up for Growth to provide a pro housing webinar that discusses the potential for impact, benefits, and recommendations for successful applications. However, time is ticking. The deadline for this one is October 30th, so I suspect if you hadn't started, this is not an opportunity for you. Supportive and affordable housing is primarily subsidized by public finance. Understanding available funding sources and how to access them helps planners connect people to the resources they need and further public missions. At the current moment, the American Rescue Plan is the most prominent source of public funding passed in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic to offer support to local communities. The available money may be used in direct pathways to aid supportive housing unit creation and or in creative ways to support individuals in the community to move from challenging situations. Obviously, that money has a timetable, and hopefully all of you have found ways to use it, but creating supportive housing units was one of the first times we saw capital money specifically available for supportive housing. CDBG funding, both for larger cities and smaller ones through state administration, may also offer continued opportunities to promote affordable and supportive housing unit creation or rehabilitation to ensure positive experiences in neighborhoods. Other resources like the Veterans Administration and the FDA also provide opportunities to access funding in a spectrum of offerings. While we were in DC for the Housing Supply Accelerator, Wisconsin native Jacqueline Otero from the Department of Agriculture Rural Housing Services outlined the many resources they have and how we can work together. From rural areas that may need tailored support for a small part of their residents to major cities that need continued funding streams, federal funding will remain the key funding to develop permanent supportive housing and affordable units. In New Jersey, a public finance agency partnered with local hospitals to develop a program where agency matched hospital funds to create housing. 5 different hospitals partnered with the developer, a nonprofit in Portland, Oregon, to create more than 350 units of affordable housing and transitional housing. Denver has connected city funding and a Medicaid carve out to pair social workers with police officers to respond to incidents that involve mental health. And here in Chicago, in Cook County, we have the Flexible Housing Pool, which receives money from Cook County, the City of Chicago, the Chicago Housing Authority, and I think about 6 hospitals to really create a bridge subsidy to house individuals who frequently use emergency rooms for shelter. Ramsey County, Minnesota used Home Art funds to obligate $37 million for affordable housing shortfalls. State and local recovery funds were used in Denver to add money to their affordable housing fund. And Irving, Texas is using CDBG funding to provide supportive services for supportive housing. So these are just additional examples of how federal funding are being used in this space. Qualified allocation plans, or QAPs, really are the baseline for how communities are providing affordable housing through low-income housing tax credit. Low-income housing tax credits, for every affordable deal I've ever done, have been the fundamental part of that. And so paying attention from planners into what's in a QAP is really, really important. Low-income housing tax credits really determine how many units in a building must be considered affordable, supportive, and other. They represent the greatest investment in new affordable and supportive housing. Knowing that QAPs provide such a vital role in affordable housing development, it really impresses upon planners the importance of us being engaged. Awareness of what is in the plans and how to advocate for adaptations of them is an emerging role for most planners, particularly those interested in housing. Localities may also have to step in surrounding access to supportive housing units as a part of LIHTC requirements. If a QAP calls for a certain number of supportive housing units in new development in order to secure funding, then local officials must help ensure those units are actually filled and expand opportunities within those buildings. QAPs are one of the best mechanisms for ensuring affordable housing and supportive housing set-asides and integration with other unit types. Codifying the immediacy of supporting housing in a way can lead to tangible increases in supportive housing units that are integrated into mixed income communities and accessible to community amenities nearby. Collaborating with and collectively identifying needs through working with public health officials, neighborhood analysis, and educational authorities can really impact how and where new housing opportunities go in place, as well as to redress systemic segregation or justice involved housing barriers. CSH worked with WIDA to conduct a statewide survey to really understand the greatest need of supportive housing and meeting those needs. Survey respondents also cited a number of challenges related to supportive housing, such as lack of case managers and other service providers, a shortage of available homes, and the need to assist new residents as they transition into coexisting with others under the same roof. Respondents also called for additional funding of sources to help meet special needs of supportive housing developments. To help close the gap between the number of organizations who identify supportive housing as a part of their mission but do not currently have development, CSH and WIDA launched the Wisconsin Supportive Housing Institute training. As a part of the initiative, WIDA and CSH kicked off a four-part webinar series that started in February 2021 to connect developers, community service providers, and other housing professionals on the basics of supported housing, integrated housing models, and supportive services and property management. I provided the link there of where those trainings are housed, so you can take a look. You can listen to the webinars and or see the PowerPoint presentations that were provided, but they're excellent resources. And lastly, no doubt as planners, we have our work cut out for us. But I know we're very capable and up for this challenge. We've faced many challenges head on before, and we all can do this. By working together, we can make our country stronger and more resilient. And we all know it takes a planner.
Planners see the opportunity in the pitfall, the thriving in the thwarted. The communal in the cutoff. The clarity in the cluttered. The undeniable in the uninspired. Seeing the possibility in once thought problems takes vision, data-driven discipline, and expertise. It takes collaboration with those on the ground to ensure a community's needs and potential are met. It takes giving decision makers the inspiration and insight to institute meaningful change. It takes a planner.
And with that, I'm ready to take some questions. And as always, I'm pretty easy to find, but if you scan this QR code, you can find me just about everywhere. So I'll leave that up and I'm open to questions.
Yes, thank you.
Or
That's a
discussion
great
even.
preview. Yeah, I'm excited to be a planner after listening, right? There's a couple of questions that people are commenting. So if you have any thoughts or questions, please put it in the chat and we'll move through those. One of the things that came up as you're talking about supportive housing, you did mention hospitals and partnering with the county and other organizations. I'm wondering, do you have suggestions for who are sort of stronger, more successful partners? Locally, we have had that with hospitals where they're doing supportive housing for single mothers or again, looking at their neighborhood need. So are there some partners you think that are more fitting for that?
I can just speak for what's working really well here in Chicago. It's our flexible housing pool, and our main contributors are the city and the housing authority and the county. So that's been that. We do have private philanthropy that's contributed a lot of money, which also gives us a lot of the staff funding. So my assistant director manages that for us, and she does a lot of the asks to hospitals. So state University of Illinois, Chicago Hospital, and those types of organizations have been some of the first hospitals to buy in and just pulling them in. So it does require a considerable amount of work. They get together every month, as well as a lot of the hospitals then do the asks of their counterparts. But I think it's just providing the data to really show for lack of a better term at the moment, the frequent flyers in emergency rooms and the cost, it really is cheaper for them to provide us with funding for housing than to continue to serve people who are in emergency rooms just for housing. But California also has a really good flexible housing pool as well. So I can provide you with some links to some of the work they're doing too to send out as well.
Okay, that's helpful. There was an early question about, we all know the word density sometimes is not received well. If you have suggestions for that, I know in my work, we've talked about, well, it means more housing choices, which in density can support more amenities, more parks, things like that. So do you have some suggestions for them to think about?
Yeah, housing options, increasing options is typically how the phrasing I've used when I do it in my work as well. I think that continues to be something that I just try to show pictures, kind of like in this presentation, of what it is I'm talking about. One of the things I have to be aware of, because I'm speaking so nationwide at this point, of making sure I have pictures that reflect, I live in Chicago, so my pictures aren't going to be really relevant to somebody in rural Wisconsin or Washington, where I'm from. So, but there are examples of what we're talking about there, and so making sure we have that. But choice, I just talk about expanding housing choices, or choice in general, but that still can be alarming to people who don't want any change.
Okay, appreciate that. I think there's some other comments that were added to that. So there's a couple of questions about condos, because from a housing perspective, there's been a price point issue there, construction costs. Do you have sort of insights on why we're not seeing as many condos built? And are there any sort of suggestions for making them more affordable?
I think right now we're all going to be, the cost of construction and labor is just ridiculously high at this point. And as a former real estate developer, it's hard to pencil out an affordable deal. So that's where it's really going to be important to think through. It's going to be public subsidy. And as much as that is something that a lot of people don't want to say, if we want affordable housing right now, it's going to be the public investment to ensure it happens. And without that, there's just literally no way to make it work without it. I'm looking at, for some of the deals we're funding right now in the central region, we're looking at $600,000 per unit for an affordable unit. So, I
Whoa.
mean,
That's not affordable, right?
exactly. So without a public subsidy, where would that land? So, the problem is often, and we just talked about this in Mississippi APA last week, the problem has been, even for, like, it was the Alabama Housing Authority talking about, for 9% tax credits, those are competitive, and it's at a point where they're competing with each other. They're competing with other projects for the same housing authority, let alone their nonprofit partners. So it's such a small pool, and even at the 4%, those deals, it's just not as much money, so it's just harder to get those deals to pencil. So we're a long way on coming on solutions for that. And if any of you have any ideas, I'll gladly take them, because we certainly are having a hard time looking at $600,000 for an affordable housing unit.
Well, and when there are the subsidies, I imagine it's very competitive, right? Because there's a
Absolutely.
broad need.
Well, I think they said in Alabama, there's like maybe 9% deals per year. So at that kind of pace.
Yeah, that impact is minimal at that point.
Yeah.
I think there's just a question, just wanting to learn a little bit more about the land trust and other, that as a tool for affordable housing. That's been talked about here, but not as implemented. Yeah.
Land trusts are definitely kind of coming on the framework, and there should be some guidance, I think, in the next APA magazine. I don't know sadly, I don't know what that rotation is, but in an upcoming planning magazine, there's going to be a great article that's looking at land trusts and some of the examples of what's working. I know we've got a few planners that I've met lately that work for land banks. So that's also another model that's starting to see a lot more movement, at least to me, more movement. I'm seeing more and more land banks popping up and partnering with them for affordable housing developing. In my previous life, when I worked for the city of Seattle, I worked for the Office of Housing, and one of our initiatives there was really looking at public owned land and make sure we were doing disposition of public owned land for the types of things we wanted. Seattle is ridiculously expensive. So this was 18 years ago, before was still ridiculously expensive then, but it was still realistic. But making sure we were prioritizing disposition of public land for affordable housing was a huge priority, and working with nonprofit developers and organizations like Habitat for Humanity to ensure that happened. I think one of the things that often happens when we do that is we don't think about long-term affordability. Like often you'll see 15 years, and 15 years just isn't sufficient. So we've got to start looking at that 30. And when I worked at Chicago Housing Authority, we did 99-year leases. So we have to be thinking about longer models for long-term affordability.
Okay, long term, right? That's the other part. I think being patient, we want to see that change immediately, right? That's part of it. There is a comment by somebody who is working in Minnesota, and
I'm reading that one.
And it's interesting between local and statewide policy. Any thoughts on that? That's
you know, coming from the state of Washington that has very, very specific statewide policy requirements to Illinois that has absolutely none. I definitely have a lot of thoughts on that. You know, I think it's hard, right? I mean, in some ways, it's nice for local communities to be able to figure it out on their own, but the reality is a lot of communities don't have the capacity to do so. So some statewide guidance, I think, is great. But at the same time, it can be strongly impactful, and it's hard to balance on what works for individual communities. So I don't have a really great answer other than understanding that I've had to deal with it. And it's, as a real estate developer, I would say it was particularly frustrating doing work in Illinois, because at least in Washington, I at least have the baseline of something versus it's the wild, wild west here. So you really have to dig deep, really, really deep in every individual community, which, you know, could be a good thing, but it was an annoying thing when I did it for a living.
I'd be curious to hear others who've done that at a statewide level and how that's balanced. I know I'm looking at if there's more questions.
In Dakota, I think that's a great point, though.
So when you talk about, you know, reducing parking requirements, we've done that in a lot of our communities here where you have a maximum, not a minimum. In the smaller community example you gave, do you know how they had that conversation with the private property owners and business owners, what that reaction was?
I don't. That's a good follow-up. I'll have to ask them. I usually pull that one because it's such a, I wouldn't have expected it for a city of that scale. But I don't really know about the conversations that led up to that. So that's a good question. And, you know, I have these parking conversations. And the one thing I always have to say around that, as a cyclist, but also a person who drives a lot, you know, I think we also have to think about when we're talking about parking, we also have to think about the communities. I live on the south side of Chicago. So, you know, after about 6 o'clock, I'm probably not willing to walk too far just for a safety concern. So we do have to think about the fact that there's a huge disparity in the types of neighborhoods our cities and our residents, and we have to be sensitive to that. Sometimes we get so excited about let's get rid of cars, we forget about not only just the safety factor in some communities, but accessibility. As I'm dealing with a parent who's aging and who's not able to walk, there's a huge battle in Seattle right now about closing down Lake Washington Boulevard for bike only. And, you know, as a cyclist, that sounds awesome. But as somebody who has a father who can't ride a bike and really walk very far, that would cut off his access to the lake. So we really have to think about, you know, how do all of these modes of transportation work together and don't prohibit and limit access to those who are not as able-bodied to do these things.
I mean, that's the point of access. While we're going through the last 5-10 minutes of questions, Blythe, our project assistant, is going to put in a survey in the chat, and we just ask you to give us feedback on today's session, but also give us ideas of potential topics or potential speakers that we can consider. Since we're virtual, our net can be cast quite broad, so we're excited about that. So she will put that in the chat. And just a reminder, as people start to drop off, the next Innovative Cities virtual lecture will be on November 15th. That's an equitable zoning panel. And then we do have our in-person event on November 30th. So we'll be sending that out as well. So I'm looking at if there are other questions. I don't know if there's any other topic. We do have another comment about the ADU criticism as being affordable. I just am curious, those communities that are not, I think like a San Francisco in terms of their market, or Seattle, how many units are truly built and considered affordable?
Well, you know, you've got that, and you also have how many units are built and actually put into the rental market versus short-term rentals or whatever that might be. So.
Right. I think that's our challenge, and we're sort of at a crossroads here. Everybody says, yes, we want them to be approved and permitted by right, but then we'll see how many are actually built.
Yeah, and so I'm looking at this last one from Palmyra. I think a lot of my efforts personally are around working within existing funding mechanisms, as well as advocating for new public funding options. I think post George Floyd, there's been a lot of CDFIs, including my own, that have freed up a lot of money to really looking at disparities in communities. Supportive housing tends to end up in communities that are typically disinvested. Certainly we want them in great opportunity areas as well, but have definitely looked at how do we identify with these emerging developers funds that are not these public funds. Just from a scale, in 2015, when I was at the Housing Authority, we selected a developer. They didn't deliver the first units using 9% tax credits to 2022. And so that's a pretty lengthy amount of time. So knowing that we're in a housing shortage, looking at other ways we can fund these deals is a huge part of the work that I'm doing. So, and I think co-housing is a model that we just have to get more people on board with. I think somewhere in there I saw somebody talking about co-ops, all of the things. I think all hands are on deck. We need to look at every option out there and make them more accessible. I saw Dan earlier talking about some of the issues that we've had with condos and kind of the funding issues that people have had around that. In some regions we're going to see insurance being a major issue. Getting property insurance for units is also a big deal. So there are a lot of things that are not zoning related that are really impacting our creating more housing that unfortunately as planners we have to become experts on, because we have to look at what these impediments are. We may not have the solutions, but we have to identify them and then work with our elected leaders and all of those folks to help them strategize and how to address them.
I think that's a good point. We often are asked to do things that sometimes we're not legally allowed to in our particular states. So that happens in discussions. We, as planners, need to be aware and then figure out either is there another solution or how can we change some of the policies. I think there's quite a few good resources that people have added in the links. This is helpful. I think it's just understanding how much funding can be combined. I think some of the projects you talked about, there's different partners, but then you're combining funding, and does that complicate the process? Right.
Yeah, I mean, subsidy layering, if you're using any federal funds, you have to do a subsidy layering review. And it's, I think one of my last deals at the Housing Authority, we had probably 10 different sources. And it probably complicated the deal on the front end, but it absolutely complicates the deal on the back end and the compliance requirements, which doesn't impact a lot of planners. But those of us who cross over to the real estate development, it's the bane of our existence. But it also increases cost. It's the cost of doing a LIHTC, and gosh forbid we start talking about a new market tax credit deal. The actual cost of closing those deals is ridiculous. So it definitely adds to the cost of doing those deals for sure.
I think, and what we found is that there are only so many of those funding mechanisms, and everybody's competing for the same pots of money. So being creative and looking at how to create different partnerships or different funding sources is always helpful. So I think as we're creative on that, that helps. I'm just looking at see if there are other comments.
A lot of these comments are tied to like the needs for greater transportation options and how that increases. I think just nationally, we have to start thinking about having multiple modes of transportation access. I mean, I'm spoiled living in Chicago and being a walking distance to the train. And if I'm too lazy to walk the 5 blocks to the train, I have really great bus support, but that's not the case for everybody. And making sure that we are providing, plans and suggestions and encouraging multiple modes of transit. As much as I hate these blasted scooters because people leave them on the sidewalk, they are great for the last 2 miles from, somebody had one in front of my house today. I was like, oh, if I joined it, I could not walk to the train today. So, I'm old, but I'm learning to embrace all of these new age multiple modes of transportation. I think it's really, really important. And I think, Tim, to your question about short-term rentals, I mean, I know in the Illinois APA Google groups, that's one of the biggest debates that's happening. Personally, I definitely have some strong opinions about it. I don't stay in them for that reason. But whether or not APA is taking a formal stance. I am not 100% sure, but I know they are doing research. You guys might have Petra come a little bit later and talk about the trend report, but short-term rentals is certainly a trend that they are addressing from a research, not having an opinion necessarily, but putting the data out there on kind of the impacts that it has. And it most certainly does have an impact on longer term rental for sure.
Yeah, our capstone graduate students did a review last year for the Department of City Development here in Milwaukee, looking specifically at the impact, what are the regulations, but also looking at what other cities are doing and how are they regulating within, you know, is it a broad regulation or is it by neighborhood? Because some neighborhoods, I think, in their proximity to downtowns or entertainment districts might have different regulations, but then what is that long-term impact on rental and home prices, right? So lots of study, I think, yet to be done, but that's something we can share some of their findings. So I know we are coming up on the 1 o'clock hour, and that's usually when we start to lose everybody, but we're being respectful of everyone's time. Last question, does anyone have a link to a comprehensive clearinghouse on funding opportunities? If you have some that you can share, Angela, we can share it through the email process after this is, again, this is recorded, it'll be shared, the recording, and we can share some resources with you as well.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. Well, I really appreciate everybody joining us. It's fun to see people from around the country having a topic that we're all looking for solutions to, but all working with. And thank you so much, Angela, for in your busy schedule, spending some time with us, sharing your knowledge and expertise is always much appreciated.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to continuing to see the work that your students are doing, particularly around that short-term rental, because I think that's going to be a hot topic. And thank you guys so much for having me. It was great joining you virtually.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the week.